Hey everyone, welcome to today's Skill Up session from ITIL and PeopleCert powered by TechStrong. I'm your host, Helen Beale, and today we're talking about how service management drives problem management as an IT discipline. On our panel today, we have Peter Madison and Donna Knapp, and maybe we'll be joined by Alan Nance shortly. But welcome to everyone and the audience. Before we get started, I want to let the audience know that this programme is live and being recorded, so you can view it again on demand. Also, there are chat and QA boxes on the right side of your screen to communicate with the general audience in chat and questions for us, your speakers. So let's start with some introductions. Donna, why don't you tell the audience all about yourself?
Hi, everybody. I am Donna Knapp. I am an author and the Curriculum Development Manager for ITSM Academy, and we offer ITIL and DevOps and lean type education. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm looking forward to talking about it.
And a DevOps Institute ambassador.
And a DevOps Institute ambassador. Thank you.
No worries. Peter, and you?
Hi, I'm Peter Madison. I'm a coach and a consultant, primarily focusing in the DevOps strategy space. I run a little consultancy called Zodiac from Toronto, Canada. And I'm pleasure to be here today. I'm also a DevOps Institute ambassador, so it's a pleasure to be here.
As am I, and if Alan joins us, he is too. So we have a lovely group of ambassadors here today. So let's start by setting the scene. I think sometimes in our market there's confusion about the difference between a problem and an incident, and there is a difference, right, Donna? So do you want to talk us through that?
For sure. Since we're talking to a service management community, I'm going to kind of rely on common IT service management definition. So an incident would be an unplanned event, some type of interruption to a service. You might call it an outage, or it's some type of reduction in quality, right? So slow response time would be an incident. And then the problem is the unknown cause of that particular incident. And with a problem, what we aim to do then is then investigate, right? Why was that there an interruption to that service? And what can we do about it?
And does that align with how you would explain it, Peter?
Yeah, I would say so. Problems have a very well-defined definition. It's like the incident is where we triage it. We get the system back online. This is where we want to make sure that everything is working. We're serving our customers. And the problem is, okay, well, what caused that? That's one example of problem. But problems also can occur when we start to see things going in the wrong direction, and we start to identify, well, here's something we need to look into, something we need to investigate as to why this is occurring. Why is our service not behaving the way that it should? And how many people are being impacted by this?
So it feels like what you're saying is that an incident is when something happens and we have a series of steps or processes that we follow to resolve that incident. But following the incident, we still need to resolve the underlying problem that caused the incident in the first place. But we never have a problem that then turns later into an incident, or can that happen as well?
Well, it can if we're ahead of time. If we've identified that, and this typically would happen in a highly complex system where you've got lots of services, and you start to see a degradation in performance, and then we start to identify that, okay, we've got something happening here in the system. We need to look into this further. We haven't entirely lost service at this point, but it's going in a direction that we're uncomfortable with. So we want to investigate what's causing this. What's causing this change in behavior of the service, and we want to set up use a problem to track the investigation of that.
So are all problems and incidents performance related, or could they be to do with the functionality rather than the availability of a system?
Yes, and I always use the people, process, technology, information approach to life. That the problem could have to do with the process that's being followed. It could have to do with the information that people have available to them for decision making when they're handling an incident, for example. It could have to do with people, and we're going to talk more about this, but this is part of why people sometimes push back on problem management, because, very often it's used to finger point or to place blame. But sometimes human beings do make mistakes. Sometimes human beings don't have the training that they need. They don't have the skills that they need. And so they're just not equipped to handle a situation that's thrown at them. And the answer isn't to place blame. The answer is to resolve all of that. So it could be, the point is, it's not just technological. It can, in fact, have to do with your organization, your organizational structure, the processes that you have in place for handling your work activities. And Helen, can I just go back to your distinguishing incident and problem? Because I have found, I'm an educator, so I have found this analogy helps people. So if you think about your house being on fire, right? And we often use in IT even the term firefighting. If you think about your house being on fire, what do you want to have happen? You want the firefighters to come in as quickly as possible and put that fire out. What happens after a fire in most cases? A fire inspector comes in and tries to figure out what started that fire, what happened. But that fire inspector doesn't come in until after the fire's out. And you wouldn't want them to. You wouldn't want the fire inspector standing at your front door, holding the firefighters back, saying, hold on, I need to figure out how this started before you can go put the fire out, right? So if you think of incident management as the firefighters coming in and putting out your fire, and you think of problem management as the fire inspector coming in and figuring out, why did this happen, right? What happened? You can kind of see the relationship between the two of them, how they work together, and quite often why we view them as separate and distinct, right? Why we don't mash them all together into a single practice or process.
I think that's a really sensible thing to do. And I think in a lot of DevOps conversations I've had with people about incident management, we've talked about the question about when is an incident closed? And we talk about when do you close that ticket? And some organizations I've worked with have closed the ticket when the problem's been resolved and they've gone back to what they were doing and they don't want to be interrupted anymore and they're under pressure because the business is asking them to push lots of change through and all of those kind of things. So we have conversations about keeping a ticket open until they've had a retrospective, keeping that ticket open until they've followed through and done the actions that are in the retrospective. But it sounds like even in that conversation there is an element missing, which is the investigation element, because you can't, in that retrospective, often immediately know what caused that problem that caused the incident.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes, of course, it is clear. And sometimes you have an incident where it's really, really clear exactly what caused this, and so there isn't, so that investigation becomes somewhat trivial. But in a lot of other cases, and I've encountered many in my career, especially if you have something like a service that's flapping, or that has unusual behavior, or you've got something that's causing a service to go offline, and you're not quite sure what's causing it, but it's happening on a regular basis, and you end up, the triage for the incident is to restart the service. And the service comes back online and everything's working for a period of time, but now I need a problem to investigate this, so I don't have to just keep restarting the service all the time. Although, as we probably know from experience, quite often what happens is that forevermore that service will be restarted and the job gets put into place to do so on a regular basis.
Right.
But that then becomes the method by which we're managing this. But then to actually dig in under the covers and look at, well, what's actually causing this? Like, how do we go about resolving this? What do we need to change about the system so that this now starts to work correctly?
So that Band-Aid approach you've just described to incident management and ongoing IT service management, for me, is an example of technical debt. And I did want to have a conversation about the relationship between technical debt and problem management. So, where do the two intertwine and how do we connect them up? So, can we be proactive about managing and identifying our technical debt, and does that help us reduce our problems in the future?
I think this is where we introduce the concept of known errors, and the idea that we know that there is technical debt in the system, and we know that there are potential problems, and this is why none of the aspects of service management exist in isolation. When we look at things like IPC type implementations, incident problem change, which are sort of the three key elements that lie together. But you also need knowledge management, because you need to be able to capture what's happened. So you've got a persistent storage and understanding. And so you can go back as you look at things like problems and look at what are your known errors, what are things that we already know, what is the technical debt we already know that exists in the system, errors that already occur, problems that we already have that this might be related to. So you can start to tie this together. And of course, that ties into asset management and so on and so forth.
Right. So knowledge management, incident management, problem management, and asset management. We've got 4 pillars, I think, from ITSM or ITIL so far.
And let's throw event management into the mix, because, there's 2 ways to deal with things like known errors and workarounds. It's either go back to development and design it out, right? Design whatever that flaw or error or defect is, design it out, right? Make a change. So now we're throwing change management into the mix. Yeah. But there's a cost to doing that. Or you may automate the workaround, right? And so you can then have a situation where event management detects something, it automatically triggers some type of process that then automatically applies that particular workaround. So you've significantly reduced the burden of, actually applying that workaround. You've probably, hopefully, eliminated any impact to your user community. They don't even know that all that went on behind the scenes. And in an organization that is, in fact, really focused on the new and the shiny primarily, you don't take up development resource, right? And yet again, you've eliminated the cost and the effort that went into applying that workaround. So it's still debt. It still exists in your ecosystem, but you've minimized the burden.
So we have these sets of management practices: change, event, problem, incident, knowledge we've talked about so far. And they're part of these frameworks, these IT service management frameworks and ITIL frameworks that we've been working with for a couple of decades, maybe more now. And today we're drilling into problem management, but what we've just uncovered is they're all intrinsically linked. So IT management drives problem management, and we use elements of the other pillars of the frameworks to help. But let's talk about how this works in, I'm going to say, the modern world, with my tongue firmly in my cheek, because it's not that different from what it was before. We still have problems, we still have incidents. In this world, though, we do have slightly different architectures, environments. So let's say the world has changed a bit in the last 15 to 20 years because we've been going through digital transformation. And as a consequence, or as of drivers and enablers of that, we should say enablers rather than drivers, we've been using a lot more cloud and ways of working techniques like Agile and DevOps in particular. I'm not saying Lean, because I think Lean has been around a lot longer. In particular in cloud, for example, we're using things like microservices, and Peter was talking about known problems. But in microservices, for example, we get a lot of unknown unknowns. It's one of the characteristics that drive us towards things like observability. So, Peter, how do these frameworks change, or how do they need to be evolved as we place them in this DevOps, digitally transformed world?
So I always look at this, or explain it from the point of view of complexity. That what happens when we move to a microservices architecture is we've taken our big monolith, sort of interconnected set of business services, and we've broken them up into lots of smaller pieces. But we've really just taken the complexity of managing all of that operationally, and we've shifted it over into lots of little pieces. So now, instead of managing the operational component of this black box in one place, I'm now managing it in lots of different places. So we've ended up shifting that operational and complexity burden over into that operational space. And where I see organizations often struggle when they go through that transition is they don't put the operational processes in place. So they've got sort of a okay sort of operational management piece when they're managing everything, when it's all centralized. And it's simple enough for them to understand. The cognitive load of understanding that is fairly simple. They've got a lot of complexity, and it's very hard to make change to that environment because you pull on one thread in that massive spaghetti and then the whole lot falls over. And but at the same time, now that they've broken it up into smaller components and they've got their interconnection, they can take those down more easily, which means they can make change to it much faster. But the understanding of the interaction between all those components becomes much more complex. And so you need to have solid operational practices to go along with that. And this is where things like ITIL and service management still have a very, very key role to play in that. And I've run into many organizations that have struggled in that transition because they've taken their business services, scattered them to the four winds in microservices, and then realized they can't actually support that environment because they don't have the right operational practices to do so.
Right.
Let's talk about those operation practices in a bit more detail. Let's do a bit of a like how-to then. So my house is semi-burnt down, but the fire is out now. I've closed my instant ticket. The service is back up and running. What happens next? Who starts the problem management process, and what is the first step?
So you'll often end up with somebody's got to be the lead, right? The problem management lead is going to say, okay, I'm going to own looking into this problem, find out what are the underlying causes.
How do we decide who that is? Do we know who our problem manager is for every particular product, or?
It depends on the size of the organization and how you've decided to structure your operational roles within that organization. Because it could potentially be somebody out of the development lead, or it could be somebody who's on the operational side, depending on how your organization has decided to structure itself. But it's typically somebody who's in a senior enough role to have visibility across all the different elements so that they can pull the information together and bring the right people to the table to have the discussion around what are the underlying causes of this, what might be causing this problem to occur.
And I think too, it's a skill set, understanding that problem management as a capability, right, is a skill set, and that there are proven methods and techniques. And, the DevOps, the third way of DevOps teaches practice equal mastery. So the more you practice these methods and these techniques, the better you get at it, the more you can do it more efficiently. And so I think the right person is somebody that has that skill set and who understands that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time we have a problem. There are proven approaches that we can use.
So we've had our instant, we've got our problem, we've probably closed our instant ticket, perhaps opened a problem ticket that is related and connected to it. We've already done some work because we've created an organizational structure that tells us who's going to own what problems in which scenarios. So it's quite clear on that role. That person we know is probably quite experienced in problem management, probably has quite a logical, detail-oriented brain, I would suggest. It's quite persistent and tenacious and likes to follow things through. Now we've got those people in a space together, so everybody that might have some knowledge to bring to bear, and we've pulled them out of their daily jobs as well. So the clock's ticking and we're burning people's time at this point. What are those proven techniques, Donna, that we can use, and how can we expedite that work to uncover what happened, dare I say, the root cause of the problem?
So they're methods that are rooted in scientific thinking, right? So there's techniques like Ishikawa diagramming. It's often known as fishbone diagramming. Simple brainstorming, right, is a good problem management method. Pareto, 80-20, the 80-20 rule, right? Really looking at and understanding, especially when you're looking at incidents holistically, understanding that 20% of your incidents are probably causing, right, 80% of the impact in your organization. So can we focus on those? A3 is a problem-solving technique that's kind of rooted in the lean. A3 The history is that A3 is a paper size. And the idea, as with all things lean, is that you can very simply, on a single piece of paper, lay out, right, what is the problem? And that includes creating a good problem statement. And then you can apply the Deming cycle, plan, do, study, act, to kind of look at, like, all right, how do we figure out what are the possible causes? Let's formulate a hypothesis in terms of what change we could make in order to eliminate those causes. Let's go ahead and perform an experiment, and then study, did we in fact, right, eliminate whatever that causal factor is? And then if not, iterate again. So those are just a few of them. Probably the one that gets bashed a little bit, but is actually the simplest, is called the 5 whys, where you formulate a problem statement and you ask why that's happening. So, a system went down. Why? Well, I don't know. The server crashed. Why? Well,
ran out of storage. Why?
Why? So the idea is that you keep drilling down through 5 layers of why, and you come to a point where you've got something you can take action on. I think why the 5 whys is kind of pushed back on is that it tends to drive you down a singular path. And kind of getting back to why do sometimes communities push back on problem management these days is, to Peter's point, the complexity, right? That there is no single root cause. There are many different causal factors that may be contributing to whatever's happening. And so we don't want to put our blinders on, right, and kind of go down a singular path. We kind of run the risk of, Deming talks a lot about the fact that if you don't fix the system, right, if all you do is eliminate one causal factor and you don't fix your system, you're doomed to have that incident happen again. So Kepner-Trego, oh gosh, I feel like I could go on and on, right? Years ago, I did a training class for Coca-Cola, which most folks are familiar with. And they were a big Kepner-Trego company. And I loved it because whenever we would teach ITIL, when we came to the course, the part about problem management, they would send in someone. I would sit down for a minute. They would send in somebody that would do a 15-minute little dissertation on Kepner-Trego. What they wanted to do was create a company of problem solvers, right? How cool is that philosophy, right? Who wouldn't want to have a company of problem solvers?
Love it.
I'm sure I missed some along the way.
Oh, well, if they pop into your head, just let us know. But so there's all this technique. So we've now used 1, 2, 3 of these techniques. We've done some experiments. We've quantified them perhaps, and we've realized that our hypothesis works and the problem is no longer there. Now, what I'm interested in understanding now is how disciplined organizations are at measuring their problems, the volume of them and the time that it takes to resolve them. So Peter, have you, in your experience, is this something that organizations are good at, or have you seen some that are good and some are really bad? What's the general modus operandi for problem measurement in organizations?
Well, I'll give the consultant answer, which is it depends. Because if there is a problem management practice, because that's kind of the underlying piece, then it will typically be better measured, right? If somebody's actually got if they understand the concept of problem. I've worked with organizations where problem and incident are basically interchangeable words. So the as we were describing earlier, that essentially, I think Helen, you were saying, it's like an incident. A problem is basically incident, and incidents are kept until they do a retrospective, and then that's it. And there's no problem management process that exists around that. It doesn't go from being an incident into a problem. So that concept, as long as that concept exists, though, and that problems are managed as a separate entity, then typically they tend to be well managed in that respect. There's always a process around it, like how do we deal with it, problems? Do we look at them on a regular basis? Are we making progress on this? At what point do we say, okay, we've spent as much time and effort as we're willing to on this problem. It doesn't seem to be recurring. We're just going to close it off because that happens too. We'll move it into a known error, and we'll keep a record of the fact that this occurred. but it could have been a one-off, just fluke chance that happens like once in a decade, where if all the stars align, then this happens, and we can't find out what the underlying cause is. We don't have enough telemetry. We don't have enough information. So we're going to just say, okay, done with that. But we're always looking at it overall as like, how many problems have we got to the root cause on it? What is the state of them at closure? What does that look like? How are we looking at problems on an ongoing basis and ensuring that they are being addressed and they're not being left to stagnate where we're not having any updates? Because that's kind of one of the main things you want from a problem perspective.
And can we call problems an element of technical debt and tag them as technical debt as we work on them?
For sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's how you get problems addressed, is that, you know, there's this age-old battle that goes on in organizations where you've got, and I'm going to use two tools just because I think they're widely recognized examples. You've got the IT service management community that's living in ServiceNow land, and you've maybe got the development community who's living in Jira land, and they're using that to manage their backlogs, and never the two shall meet. Here's the reality. How do you get problem solved? You create a backlog item and you get it prioritized along with all the other work, right? And you recognize it as technical debt, so that when, you know, some organizations go through sprint cycles where as part of that sprint cycle, they tackle a percentage of technical debt, somewhere along the line, then that problem will get addressed. So you have to kind of integrate those two worlds so that you're meeting people where they are, right? You're not trying to manage that work as separate and distinct work. I kind of wanted to tack on to Peter's. When you asked the question, Helen, about are organizations doing this well, I think the organizations that are doing it the best are, to everything Peter said, the ones that are managing problems well and understanding that this is about cost and risk, right? So there always has to be justification for the effort that you're putting into dealing with that problem. But where the highest performers shine is that they connect the dots back to incident management. They are able to show that by eliminating this problem, we were able to eliminate this particular set of incidents, and those incidents were costing our organization this much. Whether it was in lost productivity, whether it was in brand reputation, whatever, they're able to quantify the cost of those incidents. And they're able to then put that conversation into language that makes sense to leadership, right? That there's clear business benefit, right, in connecting these dots.
I'm writing a research report at the moment, the state of availability, and we surveyed the respondents, the audience, about the cost of an incident. And we've got back that the cost of an incident per minute is about $4,000 per minute. And last year we did some investigation, the average length of an incident. And the bottom line is the average amount that an incident would cost an organization is $360,000 plus per incident. And that's just kind of the running time. We've got a whole other question that looks into what you just alluded to about brand reputation, the risk of legal action, all of those other kind of things that come along with having that sort of problem. So you think that people would raise problem management up a little bit more. And I was going to talk about tools next and then culture, but I think I'm going to switch it around. You talked about Jira and ServiceNow, and there are really good integrations on the market for them. And Peter started talking about telemetry as well.
Right.
So I've almost talked myself back into doing tools first. Let's do tools first, and then we'll come back to culture. So we've talked about the incident management set of processes and then the problem management set of processes that follow. We've walked through what that looks like, that you've done some pre-planning, you've got some roles set out, you're going to get people together, you've got various tools like the 5 whys that you can go through. They're all empirical and experimental, and only when you see that problem hypothesis working out do you close that ticket. Let's talk about how to support those teams through that process. This is a system process we're talking about, right? So there is data there. How do we get that data to those people in the way that can be most useful to them? Donna, do you want to start us off here? The tools to support problem management.
So have we already thrown like configuration management into the
No,
mix?
we haven't talked about configuration
All right,
management yet.
so let's
put
start
that in
there. Like, you know, a lot of this begins with understanding, right? What are your services? What is the technology that underpins those services? Because at the end of the day, that from a system standpoint is what can break, right? So first of all, do we have that information? And why that is important is because it enables us to effectively categorize incidents. And if you're not effectively categorizing incidents, in other words, putting them into buckets to speak to what type of incident that is, you're not going to be able to do effective trend analysis. And if you can't do effective trend analysis, you can't necessarily detect the fact that you've got a problem, or it might take you longer than it should to detect the fact that you've got a problem. So, you know, having good, clean incident, capturing incidents, having good, clean incident data, whether that is captured automatically using automation and, you know, things like observability and monitoring and event management, or it's, you know, good old-fashioned human beings every once in a while still do have to create incident tickets. You've got to have that data that you can then analyze, right? And here is where modern tools really can start to help us. Just because this has been rattling around in my brain this whole entire time, I kind of want to enter this into the conversation. And it's kind of an SRE notion that if you think about the incident, it's inherently reactive, right? The incident has already happened, and now we're doing reactive incident management, and therefore we're doing reactive problem management. If we can do trend analysis, then we can do proactive problem management. So to your point way earlier, Helen, right, maybe the incident hasn't happened yet, but we're starting to see some trends that run the potential to cause impact. And so maybe we can address that before it really turns into that whatever $300,000 incident that gets talked about on Twitter. And then with, you know, observability and the most modern tools, now it becomes predictive, right? So the unknown unknowns, right? Stuff isn't even on a human being's radar yet. Technology can be detecting, and it can start to tell the human beings like, hey, right, there's something buried deep in the bowels of your system that could potentially be causing some type of an issue. So being able to shift that, and technology, you kind of can't do that without modern tools.
So telemetry and observability have been mentioned by you and me and Peter. So Peter, do you want to add in your thoughts on how we can use this data and this automation that we have available to help do predictive analytics, like Donna's just said, you know, applying AI to help us preempt failure, and also how we can expedite resolution.
Well, Donna brought up SRE, so I think I'll add in a few more acronyms to add to this and stuff.
So I normally like on these to make us actually spell them out as well. So SRE, Site Reliability Engineering, came from Google. So that's that one. Yeah.
And it's interesting because when we start to look at modern service management, this is often where people start to think about it. Like site reliability engineering is looking at the reliability of your services and helping those parts of your organization work out what reliability are we looking for here for the service that we're delivering. And some of the key concepts related to that, which tie into what we're talking about around looking at how things are trending, is we start to look at SLIs, service level indicators. We start to look at SLOs, what are our service level objectives, and we start to look at SLAs, which are our service level agreements. And so we know from this that these terms have been around for a long time, and Google didn't invent them by any stretch of imagination, but they put them together and aligned them to the concepts of an error budget and used that to drive a cultural change as a concept, as a consequence of that. But the idea that essentially I have my service level agreement is what I've agreed to my clients that the service will do. I've got my service level objective, which is what I'm aiming to get from the service, which will typically be a tighter level. And then I've got my service indicator, which is the current state of the service. And so this is where we can start to use that telemetry to say, okay, what direction is going in? Am I hitting my SLOs? because if I'm hitting my SLOs, I got to make sure I don't hit my SLAs, because at that point my service isn't performing the way it needs to. So and I can use the concept of an error budget, the portion above that, say how much tolerance do I have? How much am I willing to allow my service to degrade before I need to take action? And so using this as a sort of as your guide points and your markers, you can use this to start to look at, as I monitor my services, where am I starting to hit my SLOs? Where am I starting to not meet the numbers that I need to be at? Another important aspect of this, of course, is that there's both time-based telemetry, and then there's event-based telemetry. So you've also got to look at it from that perspective too. And there's tools that you can use to pull out from underneath it. A lot of what's done these days is based off logging services. So you use the logging services to expose that telemetry, and then that's in turn tied into that event-driven telemetry. And there's a variety of tools out there that will handle this. Then we start to look at things like observability, which is where we start to look at the telemetry for the intrinsic business services that are being delivered by this. So we're not just looking at what traditionally has been like the black boxes, like is my service up? What is its latency? What's performance? What is it? How does it respond on the outside? But we're starting to look at inside. How is the application actually performing? So I can start to make even more astute observations of the service, like is it doing the things that it's supposed to in the manner that it's supposed to? And this then in turn gives me much greater ability to start to look into what might be causing underlying problems in the system.
And I think there's a couple of bits that I'd probably like to add in there. One is the emergence of the open telemetry standard from CNCF, and how this is, for me, it's the biggest or the highest, fastest adoption curve of any standard I've ever seen across organizations. And it's really helping people build that observability into their systems. Because I think when observability sort of emerged as a buzzword 4 or 5 years ago, it really was a buzzword, and it was jumped on by a lot of the monitoring companies. And we've done it every time we get a new word in the industry. The marketing teams get a hold of it and think they're going to get a lot of clicks, and they do, but it can be a bit confusing. So for me, the way I like to explain it is observability is a characteristic of a system, just like Peter just described about the black box. So it's the data that it's emitting that allows you to tell what's happening inside it. So what monitoring is doing is it's actually observing observable systems for you, but observability is a characteristic of the system itself. And open telemetry really helps supercharge that. And then the other bit that I think is really important is, and this hopefully will lead us into the culture conversation, we are only human. We have cognitive load limits, and we're not that well set up, our brains actually, for processing data, because our prefrontal lobe can kind of only handle sort of a few actors on stage at any one point. So we're not great data processors when it comes down to it, but our computers are. So where we've got lots and lots of data, and when we've got very complex systems, as Peter described and Donna noted earlier, we've got a lot of data. So if we can use our computers to help us process those data and find those patterns and trends that Peter was referring to, we can save ourselves a lot of time when it comes to things like mean time to discovery and mean time to recovery or restore. So that's AI ops in a short word, is what we can add there as well. I wanted to note something else, actually, just before we move on to culture, it might lead us in as well. Error budgets. Now, because my background is like very much DevOps, error budgets to me really are something that belong to SRE in the way that I've learned them. But actually, the state of availability report that I've been working on for the last couple of years, that I referred to earlier when we were talking about the cost of an incident. The past 2 years, we've been asking people about KPIs for availability, and I've been surprised that both years, the most commonly reported KPI that people use for availability is error budget. And it's not downtime, it's error budget. And that's taken me by surprise, particularly when I've looked at the data on how much SRE knowledge or capability or adoption has been in the respondent set, which has been quite low. So you guys, I think, have got maybe more IT ops, ITSM experience than I have. So maybe you can help throw some light on that for me, why error budget seem to be such a common KPI or metric and so well established.
It's an interesting one, because I mean, if you look at what Google says around error budgets, the entire intent is that you should be using your error budget. So one of the things you can measure is, are you consuming it? If you're not, because if you're not, that means you're not changing, you're not innovating, you're not doing things fast enough. It's like there's this other element of error budget that is that it isn't what you shouldn't be doing, it's what you should be doing. We should be making changes at a rate, and if it causes problems within the system, then there's an amount that we're going to allow of that, as long as the system is meeting its SLAs and you're staying within your SLOs, right? We've got this portion where we can start to experiment, and that experiment is the key element which kind of drives that cultural piece that goes with it. So when we look at error budgets, they are an indicator of, well, first of all, can you define error budgets? Because if you can, then you've already gone quite a long way into understanding how your services perform, and you've also put sufficient guardrails and understanding and telemetry and observability into place to be able to measure it and be able to tell what's occurring within those systems, which gives you quite a large lever to pull on to be able to say, okay, I know what good means for my systems. I know what I can accept. And that's why I think it becomes that thing which people can say, okay, if I understand this, and that means I can understand from their 80-20 rule. It's like, if you just took it as like, what's the 20% of my entire estate that I can afford to be offline at any one time kind of thing. So where am I at that point?
Any other thoughts on error budgets?
Well, and where I think this really does tie into our whole conversation about problem management is error budgets, yes, are about kind of pushing the limits and seeing how fast can we go, right? How innovative can we be before we cross the line in the sand, right? So I always think of the error budget as the line in the sand. It's like, okay, we went too far. Well, what does we went too far look like? We're starting to see a higher number of incidents that are occurring, right? We're starting to see trends emerging, let's call them problems, that could potentially cause incidents. We're starting to see technical debt building up. So part of the premise of error budgets as well is that there is a consequence for exhausting your error budget, just like as human beings, right? When you max out your credit card, there's a consequence for that. You're going to pay higher fees, or at some point you have to like not go to the movies as often, right? And so what are the consequences here? Maybe we pay down we devote some development cycles to paying down technical debt, or we devote some development cycles to addressing incidents and dealing with incidents, as opposed to introducing the next new and shiny. So the cool thing about error budgets, and here's exactly where this comes into your culture part of this conversation, Helen, is that it's a really mature way of having a conversation, right, about how do we strike that balance between moving fast and being innovative and yet still maintaining stability. Because at the end of the day, if you're not taking care of the basics, if you're not keeping that system up and running, if you're wreaking havoc on the production environment every time you make changes, it doesn't matter how cool that next new shiny feature is, right? Because now you're starting to impact the customer experience. So error budgets give you a data-driven way to have a really mature conversation about that. And it's also a really good tool that you can use to kind of help minimize that core chronic conflict between dev and ops, right? Where dev wants to go faster and ops is saying, wait, hold on. So it's a very, very cool concept. And I'm going to give out a shameless plug. So I am a contributing author to the ITIL 4 High Velocity IT publication. And we actually talk about error budgets in high velocity IT. So it is a concept where we are seeing that come into these concepts are coming into traditional service management.
We love that plug. We're here to help people, guide them towards ITIL as this service management framework.
ITIL 4 High Velocity. Yeah. You're not supposed to like have favorite children, but of all the ITIL 4 publications, I have a particular affinity for high velocity IT.
Wonderful.
Because it really does bring kind of all this whole conversation together.
But let's talk about that more in the concept of DevOps then. So I think the kind of genesis of that particular book is what DevOps is driving. That's why it's about high velocity, because that's what we're seeing as a consequence. So with ITIL 4, it was a refresh or an update to recognize where the world was at with digital transformation and the adoption of ways of working like DevOps. Now, DevOps, though, we can feel that the DevOps world sometimes has a bit of a negative reaction. I think you've alluded to this earlier, Donna, but let's just explicitly put it out there. When we talk DevOps with some organizations, they can be quite anti-ITIL or anti-problem management. And my initial hypothesis I'm going to put on the table for discussion today is that it's seen as bureaucratic. It's seen as an old traditional way of approaching work, and therefore does not fit with our groovy, new, speedy, lean, DevOpsy way of doing things. How would you respond to that, Donna?
So I would respond by saying, in some cases, they're probably right, but that isn't because what ITIL has to say. It's because of how ITIL was applied in that particular organization. ITIL was viewed as a Bible. It was viewed as a set of rules. It was viewed as like a singular, definitive way of doing things, and never we shall deviate from the path. And ITIL itself doesn't even say that, right? ITIL says adopt and adapt. Understand your organization's circumstances and needs and goals and adapt accordingly. And so it's a misapplication of ITIL that has led to a lot of bureaucracy. A lot of sins are committed in the name of ITIL. Like, I see it all the time. But you know what? A lot of sins are committed in the name of customer satisfaction and customer experience too. Like, we have a tendency to get like we're zealots about some concept. And so we overdo the concepts. So number one, ITIL never intended for organizations to be as
prescriptive is the word I always use.
Bureaucratic and rigorous as they are. So if your processes are bureaucratic, you have to understand that you made them that way. Human beings made decisions somewhere along the line that resulted in the processes and practices looking the way they do. And you know what? You can undo that. And that's what ITIL 4 then tries to bring to the conversation is, look, the world has changed and traditional ways of working, not every project is a waterfall project anymore. And so we're not going to handle deployment release activities the way we did back in that waterfall world, right? We've got agile projects and we have to rethink how we're handling things. We have to rethink, how practices like change management. So ITIL 4, I think today, like if we talk about today, the folks who are still pushing back on ITIL haven't looked at ITIL 4. And quite frankly, ITIL 4 is what, 6 years old now, right? So if you're talking about ITIL being bureaucratic, you're throwing back to a previous version of ITIL that's long gone, right? And the ITIL community has moved on and embraced all these new ways of working. I actually talk to organizations, just to bring up high velocity IT again, I talk to organizations who high velocity IT is the future for them, right? So in that case, ITIL is even ahead of where they are, right? These concepts that we're talking about here are kind of ahead of where that organization is. So there's a lot, meet your organization where it is and take up from it what you can to improve.
I like that, the meet the organization where they are, because it always is. It's this interpretation of it that often goes wrong. It's because there can be times when that implementing this in a bureaucratic manner is the right thing to do. I've seen organizations where essentially it was the Wild West in terms of changes were constantly being made into production, but they were having consistent production outages on an ongoing basis. And some of the best thing to do at that point is just stop change, right? So until you could start to understand how is the system behaving. And so really putting rigorous process into place can be very good in that instance, in that you could start to get control and start to deliver a higher quality service to your customers before they all leave. So there can be a reason to do that. The part where people then go wrong is exactly as you were saying, Donna, is the going back and then it's the looking at this again, like is this still serving us? Is this doing what we needed to do? Are we continuing to improve? Are we going back and looking at our processes and changing them? And what historically had happened in organizations is they'd had that sort of catastrophic thing that occurred, or they had decided to just start that way, and they'd put all that bureaucracy into place, but never gone and looked and say, well, is this actually doing what we needed to do? Are we improving? Does this meet the needs of the organization that we have now versus the organization we put this into place for however many years ago?
Yeah. One of our clients, and this is going back a few years now, they one of the things they did, and this kind of the genesis for it was in fact bringing DevOps into the organization. But one of the things that they did is they looked at all the policies and controls that they had in place in their organization, and they made a clear distinction between something that is a control because in fact it's a regulatory control, right? It's the law. We must do this. We have no choice. And something that was a policy that was put in place. And to Peter's point, probably because somebody did something boneheaded on a given day. And so instead of coaching and counseling that individual person, they put in place a blanket policy that applied to everybody. And now we put in a layer of bureaucracy. So anything that was an internal policy or kind of an internal control versus like, it's the law, we have to do this. They really examined and they eliminated like a lot of policies, a lot of approval gates, a lot of controls that they had in place. And that alone, right, helped them to significantly speed up. And whenever I talk about this, I always think about Mike Orzen. Mike Orzen is the author of Lean IT. And one time I asked Mike, why do we tolerate waste so much, right? Why do organizations tolerate waste? And his answer was because waste becomes work, right? It's like we think that's the way we're supposed to do it. We don't necessarily, to Peter's point, take that step back and go, hold on, this is wasteful. Like we don't need to apply this policy blanket to everybody in the organization. Maybe we put in place a good guideline and we coach and counsel people when they go outside the boundaries. So I think that is part of continual improvement. And here's, just to circle back, problem management can help with this, right? So if you have a problem, if you have process or a value stream that has really bad flow, right? There's a lot of bureaucracy. Use proven problem management techniques to figure out, right? What you can use theory of constraints, right? What's the constraint? Why, what's impacting the flow of this particular value stream or process, and then, put forth some hypotheses on in terms of how we can improve it. So you can actually use problem management to help kind of improve.
You get Peter and I excited by saying value stream management with 8 minutes to go.
Well, I mean, a lot of the work I do is in the SDLC space too. So I love what Donna's talking about at the moment, because that whole like policy piece of it. And you mentioned this earlier, Donna, around the risk versus cost element of it. It's like, are we actually looking at risks? Are the controls we have in place actually addressing risk? Right. Or are we, when we start to put these checks and policies into place, are we doing them for the right reasons? It's the age-old, well, I'm just going to add a checkbox here. And then the person who insists on that checkbox being the right way to ensure that, say, entitlements have been put into place. And nobody remembers, it doesn't actually do anything. It's like people are just always going to check the box.
Right.
Because that gets me to the next stage of the process. It's just it hasn't addressed any kind of risk. It's absolutely pointless.
Right.
Organizational scar tissue. And I loved Donna's story that someone actually took the time to scrape away at that scar tissue and reveal the beauty within that was what's possible. So we've got about 7 minutes left. I have noticed we do have a question from the audience, which is about AI. So I thought we could have a little look at that and then maybe talk about futures if we've got any time after that. We did touch on AI earlier when we were all talking about tools, and I was talking about AI ops in particular, which is more of an algorithmic driven AI that looks for trends and event patterns across the data. This question is actually more about generative AI. So for the benefit of the audience, the question is, the integration of generative AI technologies like chatbots and automation tools into service management practices sounds promising. However, what potential pitfalls or risks should organizations be aware of when implementing these technologies, and how can they mitigate them effectively? So generative AI and algorithmic AI both do the same thing fundamentally, in terms of they make it easier for humans. They basically save us a load of time. So they save us time finding problems, or they save us time writing words and digesting data in the form of language and producing an answer. So we can use them in things like knowledge bases and chatbots and things like that. Like you've said, I think for me, the biggest pitfall to watch out for is they're not always right. You know, they are trained by humans. There's a large language model behind them. So they do need to be trained and checked, depending on what use case you're using them with. I'm getting lots of nods. But Donna, would you add anything else?
Yeah, and the knowledge base, right? The knowledge management. You know, a lot of organizations aren't good at knowledge management. And so what you have to really look at, what, you know, information and knowledge you're using to train, you know, those programs. So it's one of those things that I personally am equally fascinated and horrified by everything that's going on with this, because it could go horribly awry, or it can absolutely have a positive impact. So you do have to understand, right, how the training that goes into it, the analysis that has to go into it. I think in general, organizations are so enamored with anything that can be handled in an automated way someday, and they lose sight of the fact that potentially that automation could break on any given day. And is there anybody around in your organization anymore that understands, right, what to do when the automation breaks? So, right, or what to do when the AI is going in the wrong direction, right? Is somebody monitoring that stuff and stepping in, right, and making corrections when they're needed?
Yeah, I would agree. It's that where things like generative AI really shine is if I've got some data and I want to know sort of what are the possible options out of all of this, but you've got to have that sort of oversight of the information that's given back to say, does this even make sense?
Right.
Is this guiding me in the right direction? What are the possibilities? It's because, to one of your earlier points, Helen, there's a massive data. We've got more data than we've ever had before that we can pull out. And things like generative AI can be great for like pulling that together. And from a problem management perspective, helping give you possible options, possible directions to look in. Where might you want to explore? I think where there's the risk is if you entirely rely on it at this point in time to point you in the right direction, at least, especially given what a generative language model is and how it's actually behaving. I think the algorithmic ones are going to be operating a little bit differently. You can probably have more trust in what like a monitoring system's algorithmic direction from something like an AI ops type tool is pointing you in the direction of, versus generative AI, because that's really just using language to kind of take a guess at what direction to put you in. Which can be a blessing and a curse, because it could be entirely wrong. It does really depend on how it's being fed, what information it has, to whether it can derive from it and what it derives from it.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, so I think we should wrap things up a bit. So first of all, I'm going to just reiterate what today's topic was, which was about how service management drives problem management as an IT discipline. I think the team have done a great job. I think we've explained how the components from configuration, event change, incident problem, and knowledge management all connect together underneath the ITSM frameworks, in particular, of course, the world's leading framework, ITIL. And we've seen how problem management connects to all of those other pieces within it. In terms of finishing up, let's just kind of do a key takeaway and a little futures thing. So I think my key takeaway, I think Peter liked this as well, was when Donna said about meeting the organisation where they are. And I think most organisations are trying to catch up with what's possible at the moment with ITIL 4, particularly the high velocity piece of that, and with the AI ops and with the large language models and generative AI that's available. There's a lot of opportunity to do things that I think most people aren't doing at the moment. So the kind of future's here, it just needs to be harnessed at this point for me. Donna, what are your final thoughts for the audience?
So I'm going to pluck the word discipline out of the title, of recognizing that this is in fact is a discipline. There are proven methods and techniques that you can learn and practice and master, and recognize that all this AI and observability and all these, modern approaches really have the potential to identify more problems than you ever knew you had. And so you need to be prepared for that. And that's where understanding the discipline, understanding that this is about costs and risks and being methodical and making sure that you're applying your resources in areas that are really going to make an impact come into play. It's a skill set.
And the final thought for Peter today.
I think the whole not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, and the problems where we service management is still very, very relevant, even in a fast, high velocity delivery world. It's important to understand and what the practices are around that, as Donna put it, the discipline around it. How do we put that together? And we have more tools at our disposal than we ever had before, which allows us to do some really interesting things that were harder before. But we still need to have those practices in place and this understanding of how to go about solving problems when they occur, because otherwise you'll run into a situation at some point where the tool doesn't have an answer for you, and you need somebody in the organization who's going to be able to open up the engine and work out what's going on here.
Right.
Absolutely. So thank you, audience, for joining us today to consider how service management drives problem management. And a very big thank you to our panelists, Donna and Peter. Next up in the ITIL program is how reporting and analytics are applied to service management on Tuesday, September the 19th. And the registration page is pinned in the chat. Once more, thank you to Donna and to Peter, and thank you, audience. See you somewhere, sometime.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.